it's still a kickoff. And I first want to just start by saying thank you so much for signing up and wanting to be part of this, what we think is an amazing program. I'm Shirley Kessel. I'm the executive director of Miles for Migraine. And together with pretty much big number of team members here this evening, we have been working very diligently to bring you this program. And we hope that, maybe everyone needs to mute themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me just move forward. I just want to say, I want to welcome you. This is a new era in migraine treatment and advocacy. And as you already know, this disease robs people of the precious moments of their life. And why is it that a disease that affects so many people receives so little attention in the media, a small stipend for research funding, and until recently has only now just seen the first preventive drug developed to be specifically indicated for migraine? And in a nutshell, I think the answer to this lack of advocacy, in a nutshell, I think the answer is that it's a lack of advocacy. But how can someone advocate when they feel stigmatized by friends, family, coworkers, employers, and sometimes even their own doctor? And of course, I don't mean the headache specialists, but of course, other doctors, and especially maybe your primary care doctor. For those of you who have been diagnosed with migraine or another headache disorder, when you first went to your healthcare provider, did they prescribe advocacy as part of your treatment plan? And my guess is the answer is no. And why is it that when a disease that causes so much disability, why is that? I mean, why is that the case? Raise your hand if you were prescribed advocacy when you first were diagnosed. Well, when I was first diagnosed about 35 years ago, I was not told that the reason I was receiving a drug for epilepsy was because there were no preventive drugs specifically designed to treat migraine. Advocacy and migraine, advocacy. Oh, I got muted. Okay. Advocacy for migraine and other headache diseases is really in its infancy. It's only in the past 5 to 8 years that so many advocacy organizations have cropped up. Compared to the awareness for other common diseases, our disease space is behind schedule. So the time has come to act now. We are responsible for moving the needle on this disease to bring it the awareness it deserves, the research funding, the credibility, and respect. We need to act now by making as much noise as possible so we can receive more treatment options, better access to these drugs that are available to us. We need better government policy so that one of our community members applies for disability, they're not told to use a diagnosis of epilepsy in the Blue Book, also known as the Social Security Administration listing of disabling impairments. All of us need to come out of the darkness, and we need to tell everyone we know, even we need to yell that just because this disease is invisible doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve the attention that and respect that it deserves. The time to act is now. If not for yourself, then for your child, your future grandchild, or other loved ones. I know this firsthand. My mother had disabling migraine, and as a child, I was her caregiver. I was the oldest of 3 children. I inherited this disease and was disabled by it in my 20s. Then I passed the disease to 2 of my 3 children with disabling consequences. I'm a person with migraine and a caregiver at the same time. I'm not going to skirt around the issue. I'm exhausted from feeling this way. How about you? What's your story? For the next 6 months, we will learn together on the most significant topics in advocacy. Then we hope you will feel inspired to use your learnings to orchestrate a project of your choice. We will guide you, of course, but don't be surprised, as I'll probably hint more than once, that we want to create a field presence in our fellowship cities. Yes, we really want to develop live chapters for all the people to come together and practice advocating while also learning more about this disease and, of course, have fun. So now I want to turn the podium over to Helen, who is our director of event production, who's going to go over some housekeeping notes for us.
There aren't many housekeeping notes, but I've already mentioned that the most important one is that we know who you are. And at this point, we're identifying many of you with your city. So if you would go to the participant list and select yourself with the 3 little dots and indicate which city you're from. And I'm happy to do it for you. Just put it in the chat. We'll go ahead and update that for you if you like. I'm also going to put in the chat, we are hoping that each of you join our private Facebook group, where after each of these sessions, we will engage in conversations based on some of the topics and thoughtful questions that our presenters will present to you. And we want this to be a forum for you to share with one another, so that we ask that you follow the private Facebook group and contribute as you see fit. It's perfectly, it's just us. So you don't have to be afraid. It's a non-judgmental environment, and it's a place where you can come to speak to one another. So we're welcoming your comments there. We're also going to ask you, before we begin, we would like you each to take a quick survey. I'm going to put a link in the chat. If each of you would copy this link, and you'll be directed to a form that has just a couple questions, and we're going to give each of you a few minutes to answer them. It's important for us to be able to measure the success of this program, and in order to do so, we need to sort of see where we are today and where we will be at the end of this 6 months, which we know will be significantly different. So it's fine. If all of your answers are, I don't know, no, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're trying to see, how much we can be a part of your advocacy journey. So take a minute and
Helen, it looks like there needs to be like permission for it. So I don't know if it's
Okay.
open, you know,
Great.
like if you need to make it open.
Thank you, Courtney. It should be, but let me do that right
Where
now.
do you copy to? I copied it, but I don't know what you copied to.
Copy it into a new browser.
Oh, geez.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not
We
following.
should be good.
Where's the link? I'm sorry.
Look in the chat, in your chat.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. That's what we're here for. Go in your chat box and copy that and put it in a new browser, and it should.
It's
I've
working
opened it up.
now. It
Okay,
is
good.
working
Thank
now.
you. Thanks. Appreciate it. We'll just go silent for a couple of
I
minutes
don't know
so
how
that
to
each of
do
you
that.
can do
I'm
that.
sorry. I can't do
No
it.
problem.
I
Oh,
just
you're on your phone, right, Francine?
I'm on my phone and it's just like
Do
crazy.
you see chat in your phone?
Yeah, I got that and I copied, but after that, that was it.
On your phone, go to your Safari and open a new browser.
Yeah, but I mean Zoom now. Can I do that? Let's see, how do you do that? Okay, new browser.
Yeah, Zoom will play in the background still,
Oh, I
so you
see.
can like, just don't close the app.
Yeah. No, copy, share, copy. No, cannot do it.
We can email it to you.
Yeah, that'd be better. Thank you. Wow.
Okay,
You know where to find you.
we know you, Francine. I'm going to email it to you right now, and if you don't, you can do it. I'm sending you an email right now. So we'll just give you a few minutes. Those of you asking about what city, if you will put what city you're partnering with your fellow, not necessarily where you live. Great. I see a number of you are doing it. We'll just give you another minute or so.
So your first act of advocacy can be to take a picture of the screen and post it somewhere on social media if you feel so inclined. I just see that Dr. Arca posted on Facebook, on Twitter. So Dr. Arca is a fellow at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona, and she's also a board member of Miles for Migraine. And you will get to hear her speak during these sessions.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here tonight.
There she is. Okay, I think we can, I'm just going to keep speaking for just another moment while you're finishing up. We would like the opportunity, we definitely want you to fill out this survey because we're hoping that as this program gains momentum, perhaps we can do a publication in the future to do some research about whether this program is effective and what happened with the outcomes. And this really needs to happen in our community because, like I said before, in the migraine community, we have done so little in the past that now we are really just getting started and we're gaining momentum, but we need to do so much more. So I think we're finished with the housekeeping notes, Helen, right? I think I can introduce our first speaker, but I don't know who's going first. I'm embarrassed to say.
I'll go first.
Oh, but I plan to go first.
Okay. Well, I'm not touching that.
I don't mean to step over the man here, but I actually organized my talk around yours.
Okay, let me just take a moment. I just want to take another moment to thank our sponsors. And we will be posting those sponsors in our Facebook closed group just because without their support, we would not be able to put on this program. So let me start by introducing Dr. Joanna Kempner, who is an associate professor of sociology at Rutgers University, where she studies science, medicine, and inequality. Her work on health and justice, stigma in medicine, and the political suppression of science attempts to give a voice to those we rarely hear from. Her writing addresses the lack of effective treatments effective treatments for pain, gender, race, and stigma, and the extraordinary lengths that people will go in order to find relief. She is the author of the award-winning book, Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health. And I do recommend, we'll be putting this also in our Facebook closed group, and I will put it into the chat. Right now, you can buy Dr. Kempner's book for the very low price of $2.99. It is definitely something that I encourage all of you to read. Dr. Kempner is also currently writing about cluster headache patient-led efforts to bring psychedelics back to medicine. Her research can be read in a wide range of academic and popular publications, including Science, PLOS Medicine, Social Security, Social Science and Medicine, and migraine.com. Dr. Kempner.
Hi. Okay, now I'm unmuted, right? Thank you, Helen, for putting that up. And thank you, Bill, for letting me go first. Dr. Young, sorry. I'm just trying to get my own screen set up here without screwing everything up here. Now you know what it's like to be in my my Zoom classes, my Zoom lectures, where I'm forever going, how does this technology work? Okay, just give me just 1 second. Anyway, thank you guys so much for inviting me. I'm completely honored for this invitation. I'm just really excited also about this program. Miles for Migraine has really transformed what's possible in migraine advocacy. And always happy to talk about migraine and headache stigma. So I've been at this for a while. I started my research on migraine about 20 years ago, and I eventually became a full-fledged advocate, largely because I think because Dr. Young made me. He said, you can't just be a researcher anymore, you have to start advocating. A lot has changed in that time. 20 years ago, there was really no migraine advocacy to speak of. And everything looks different now. And I'm just a lot more optimistic about what the trajectory of migraine and headache disease. Sometimes people wonder what a sociologist is doing in medicine. But a lot of what I do is I think about how knowledge is created, and importantly, what knowledge is not created. And so one of the questions that's really driven my research all of this time is this puzzle, which is like, how could it be that something like migraine, which is a disease we all know causes so much pain and disability and economic burden, how could it be so ignored, dismissed, and delegitimated? We talk about migraine as an invisible disease in that people can't see that we have it. And I have migraine, I have chronic migraine. Well, it's also invisible in the sense that like the world doesn't see it. Like the world doesn't see it as this big public health problem that it is. And so that's like a kind of sociological puzzle. Like how do we not see these giant social problems? So I have, over the years, started to come up with an answer to that. And I think, Helen, you can switch over a slide now. I have to see if I can switch over my notes. There we go. The fundamental problem here is that migraine's treated like migraine's a major public health problem. It's treated like a minor personal health issue. And the diagnosis here really is stigma, right? But what is stigma? What does that mean? Far too few people understand how often headache diseases like migraine and cluster headache debilitate and devastate individuals and their families. I mean, we've all heard people say like, have you tried aspirin? Have you tried yoga? Have you put like salt behind your ears? Like people have all kinds of ideas about what this like small little problem we have is. But even fewer understand that migraine and headache disease present this major public health problem. It costs billions of dollars in healthcare, lost wages and productivity. There are far too few headache specialists to serve the patients who need them, and far too often neurologists who really should know about how to treat headache don't have enough education, don't even want to treat people with headache and migraine. And GPs who should be able to treat a simple case of migraine miss the diagnosis altogether. It's great that we have CGRPs now, and it's great that the pharmaceutical industry is interested in funding migraine advocacy and migraine research right now, but we can't rely on that private money alone. That money will disappear when when the patents disappear. And the NIH, which is the largest funder of biomedicine in the world, has never come close to providing sufficient funding for migraine or headache research. Okay, so the next slide, Helen. Thank you. So what is stigma? Stigma is a deeply discrediting attribute that comes with community sanction. This is a concept that was originally developed by Irving Goffman in the 1950s, and I know Dr. Young's going to cover some of the same ground. The basic idea is like the scarlet letter, right? Some stigmas are highly visible, and other stigmas are things that you can try and hide and not reveal. But once you do have to reveal them, they come at great cost. So you can think of that as like the box in employment forms where you have to check whether or not you're a felon. And if you're a felon, that comes with all of this kind of discrimination against you. You can also be born with stigmatizing qualities. Blackness in America has for far too long meant discrimination and severe marginalization. But it's equally important to understand with stigma that it's a social construct. Social construct means that what is stigmatized and the meaning of these characteristics and qualities changes over time and across cultures. And stigma like gains its power from the culture we live in. which means, I think really importantly, that it can change. So if you want to take fatness for example, like at some historical periods, fatness was seen as a sign of wealth, and that's still true in certain cultures, but not in the US right now, where it's seen as it's associated with poverty and with sloth. We also know that stigma can be embedded in disease. So today, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to explore a little bit more about what I mean when I say stigma. And my hope here is that you can start recognizing what stigma is, because I think that recognizing it and seeing it as it's happening is the first step in changing it. So Helen, if you can change the slide again. So I'm going to just open this up for you guys. Like, what are some of the common misconceptions that people have about migraine and headache disorders? I don't know if you want to unmute or if it's easier for chat.
That it's just a headache.
Just a headache. So it's
Just
a
a
minor
headache.
issue.
That it will like just go away in like a few seconds, and you know, like
Easy.
yeah,
It's temporary. It goes
it's so
away.
temporary. Yeah.
That taking like Tylenol will help.
Yeah. Easy to treat, right?
That it must come because you're too stressed or something.
Yeah, that you can control it if you
Right.
want it.
Yeah.
The level of pain and the other symptoms that come along with it.
Again, it's minor, easy to treat,
It's all in your head.
Yeah.
like
and, like,
psychological.
But only women suffer from it.
like drink water.
Yeah, it's a women's disease.
Their experience is the same as your experience.
Yeah, it's that everybody has like the sort of, it's all the same phenomena, right? So people don't recognize that it's a spectrum.
It will go away at menopause.
Yeah, right. That would be great.
You're just trying to
Or
get
when you
out of
get
the work you
pregnant.
want to do.
It's an easy excuse. That's right.
I've had multiple people tell me that if you get pregnant, it'll go away.
Yeah, that also.
You must be weak if you can't control it.
Yeah, it's associated with this moral quality of weakness.
Do you hear? Oh, yeah, I have bad headaches too.
Yeah, people, which might be true, but you know, people sometimes falsely, they don't understand how severe it can be, right? So you have these like general ideas about what, you know, you're always hearing these like misunderstandings of what migraine is. So Helen, can you move the slide ahead again? So some of these ideas, these misconceptions about what migraine is, fall under the category of what we call public stigma. And so these are the social conditions and the cultural norms that produce a common sense understanding of what migraine is. And what I want to just say about that is those ideas didn't just come out of nowhere, that they've come out of centuries of and layers of understanding, right? So you can't just, you know, snap your fingers and make people understand what migraine is. So if you can switch the slide, Helen, I'll talk a little bit about some of these ideas. Okay, I have first a couple of like, you know, images that we are accustomed to seeing from migraine. Some of them are like these old ads, right? When you're feeling a heat beat, tense, irritable, headachy, take a bear break. And that captures a lot of the ideas that you guys were talking about, right? That migraine is just stress. And you feel, you know, irritable, and then you take, you know, Excedrin or whatever, and you feel better. Well, that is a vintage advertisement, but you know, those ideas are still alive. They don't just go anywhere. Or, you know, you always see this woman with migraine, like that's the depiction of migraine. And I always say like that also looks like somebody who's just trying to find their keys, right? Like it doesn't look like somebody who seriously has a problem. And she also looks very made up and beautiful. And she's also a particular kind of woman, right? She's white and she looks, you know, well off. She doesn't look like a, you know, somebody who's really struggling here. And then the other thing that always comes up with migraine is this metaphorical use of migraine as just like a little problem, right? So nobody yet, I haven't heard, has talked about Trump's recent problems as just a migraine. They seem like something bigger, but that migraine often gets used in this way. Helen, can you switch slides again? This is one of my favorite cartoons because it kind of gets at this metaphorical use of migraine. So you see these two women having coffee, and the caption is, "I had a headache, but he went away." And so this captures that idea that headache is this, small, stressful thing, but it's also about sex, and it's also about like excuses. Like it kind of gets at all of those gendered elements about migraine as well. So Helen, can you move forward? And so you get these ideas, people, like the ideas are just out there in the world. It's the water, it's the air we breathe, it's the water we swim in, and you just absorb them through osmosis. That's where they come from. But they have a really profound effect on how people think about themselves. So Joan Didion wrote a really famous essay about migraine I think in the late 1970s called In Bed. This is a quote from it where she talks about the effect that stigma has on her. And she says, all of us who have migraine suffer not only from the attacks themselves, but from this common conviction that we are perversely refusing to cure ourselves by taking a couple of aspirin, that we are making ourselves sick, and that we bring it on ourselves. And I think it's really notable that, even in the 70s, like that sounds like something we could be saying right now. Helen, can you move this forward? So, these ideas go all the way back to the early 18th century. Alexander Pope, in his famous kind of like epic poem, Rape of the Lock, the main character, Belinda, is in one of the stanzas, she is in bed with a megrim because the Baron has cut her favorite lock of hair. I mean, that's what this poem is about. Like, the Rape of the Lock is that her hair, she had a bad haircut, and, she's in bed with a migraine. So like these ideas are really old and entrenched. Helen, can you move forward one more time? And they continue. So I'm going to just skip ahead 200 years to the mid 20th century, when migraine science actually starts developing. And migraine researchers actually start using like real tools to understand that migraine is physiological, but they also are still really thinking about migraine as a kind of psychological issue. And here is Harold Wolff. Harold Wolff is considered you can probably hear my kids screaming, I'm sorry, the father of modern headache medicine. And he developed this idea of a migraine personality, in which he says the individual with migraine aims to gain approval by doing more than and better than his fellows through application and hard work, and to gain security by holding to a stable environment. And his ideas were translated into popular culture then. That's what this article next to it is about. Harold Wolff had migraine himself. He treated very well-to-do patients. And so he was really describing himself. He just thought like men who worked too hard got migraine and they needed to take a break. But when he talked about women with migraine, his tone changed. And he didn't talk about women that often, but when he talked about women with migraine, he usually talked about how they needed to have sex with their husbands more. The men with migraine, they were fine having sex, except that their wives didn't have sex with them enough. Helen, can you move forward again? Now, his colleagues took this notion further, and Walter Alvarez, who is one of the founding members of what is now the AHS, the American Headache Society, I mean, he just went bonkers with this idea that women who had migraine had like real deep psychological problems. So this is a quote from one of his early articles in 1952, and he talks about the idea that when a woman is having at least 3 attacks of migraine a week, she is either psychopathic or else she's overworking or worrying or fretting or otherwise using her brain wrongly. So he used to give advice to women that they should just relax. They should stop worrying about their husbands. Their husbands were angels to put up with them anyway. They should stop thinking about divorce and then all their problems will go away. And this picture here is actually an ad from the journal Headache, the medical journal. And you can see the Victorian trope of the woman kind of playing itself out. Helen, can you move ahead again? Now the reason why I think all of this is important, these 300 years of history of migraine being about, thought of as something that, is just women's overreaction to, bad haircuts or women not having sex or women worrying about their husbands, is because we still kind of think those things, right? So here on the one side, you have the housewife headache. This is an ad, again, from the mid-20th century. And I sort of love this ad because it captures so much, right? On the top of this ad, you have the woman kind of staring out, thinking about all of her household duties. She has to iron, do dishes, the groceries, and carpool. And the headline says, when boredom and emotional fatigue bring on housewife headache. So then she takes her medicine and look how happy she is with her incredibly handsome, square-jawed husband. But we still have that. I mean, as you guys said, we still have this idea that migraine's just an excuse, that migraine's just people who can't deal with stress, that migraine's something that you can control. And then on the other side, this is an ad, it's now 20 years old. It's from, it was an Imitrex ad. And you have this woman who she's a nurse. She has a migraine. She can't do her job, her basic duties, which is to take care of babies. And the next part of the advertisement would be she took the medicine and then she's snuggling with a baby. But we see this trope all the time. So anyway, these are very deeply embedded ideas about what migraine is. It's not that big of a deal. It's due to stress. It's not that big of a deal. You take some medicine, you feel better, you can go back to being a woman. Helen, can you move forward again? There's a couple of things I just want to say about this, point out about these ideas that kind of float out there in the world. The first one, because I think they help identify what stigma is. The first one is this conflation with moral character. So if migraine becomes not just something you have, but it's something you are. And the something you are is weakness. The something you are is neurotic. The something you are is a little bit hysterical. So what I have here is a picture from a New Yorker article, one of those little short blurbs they have in the front of their magazine. They covered, I think it was in 2009, Cindy McCain became a spokesperson for migraine and she addressed the International Headache Society. And the New Yorker covered it. And I just want to just quickly talk about how they covered her, because I thought it was really telling. So they, first of all, you can see in the picture the way they kind of exaggerate her features. First of all, they titled that segment "The Not Tonight Department." And they start by listing migraine as one of the many ailments that Cindy McCain had already complained about, including a sprained wrist, which she obtained, quote, when a supporter of her husband's presidential campaign very vigorously pumped her right hand. And then they go on in this little blurb to say everything about her seemed lemony, and they described her commentary about migraine as, quote unquote, astringent. So they really describe her as this overprivileged socialite whining about an insignificant comfort, kind of just perpetuating, again, an insignificant problem, just another white woman, just super neurotic. And that's the other thing. Oh, Helen, can you move forward? Yeah, so that's the other thing that I wanted to point out is that, stigmas can intersect as well, right? So your race, your gender, your disability status, all of these things are stigmatized identities. Migraine is a stigmatized disease. And the fact that migraine is associated with being with women as a women's disease, and we know that, you know, women are constantly gaslighted at the doctor's office. Those things intersect. But migraine isn't just any women's disease. Migraine is a white women's disease. That's what we see, right? We don't really see migraine being treated as a disease that affects Black women, a disease that affects poor people. And we certainly don't see it very often being associated with men. Some of these things are changing. Certainly the pharmaceutical industry has been interested in changing those ideas a little bit. Helen, can you move forward a little bit? Or press it one more time? So the question that I have is that, you know, what happens when, if migraine is associated with neurotic white women, then who else is rendered invisible in this stigmatized identity? Who else are we not seeing? So we're not seeing men, but we're also not seeing Black women. We're not seeing other women of color. And the reason that I really want to point that out to you guys as groups of advocates is because those marginalized identities are not being represented. These are not interests that are being represented anywhere in any strong way in our advocacy world. I mean, there are occasional voices, but we need to bring in much more diversity and representation in our advocacy efforts. The stigma of race is, and particularly Blackness, is particularly important when it comes to pain. If white women are considered sensitive, and so sensitive that migraine just puts them into bed, they only have that privilege because they've always had Black women to do their work for them. And Black women have never had the privilege to go to bed when they had pain. We know this from a history of Black people being denied the ability to even experience and feel pain. And so, you know, we have to think very hard about what that means and how these stigmas kind of intersect and what they mean for patient care. Helen, can you move forward again? So I'm just going to very briefly, because I know that I'm taking up all of Dr. Young's time, and also I know he's going to touch on this, mention that there are other forms of stigma. So these public stigmas do embed themselves in our institutions. They become embedded in organizational culture and policies. And I'll just name one example really quickly. Helen moves forward. So the one that I think is really problematic in headache medicine, and people may debate me on this, is the burden that headache medicine puts on patients when headache medicine focuses so much on triggers. This notion that patients have even control of when they're going to have a migraine attack, and that they can control these triggers, many of triggers which are absolutely uncontrollable, means that, you know, the public is going to be asking, you know, people like, well, what did you do wrong? Did you drink enough water? Did you get enough exercise? Are you doing the right behaviors? And Helen, if you can move forward. It also increases the kind of guilt and burden that we feel, right? Are we doing the right things to keep our migraine attacks reduced? And that brings me to self-stigma, which is this idea that we start to absorb and believe the assumptions and stereotypes that people tell us about ourselves. And that has ultimately really negative impacts on our health, which I know Dr. Young is going to speak about. So Helen, can you move forward? Oh, keep going, because I think I had this on animations. Okay, so I thought really hard about what take-home message I really wanted you guys to have as advocates. Like, I've been doing this for 20 years, and like, what is it what can I tell you about stigma that you don't already know, that you haven't already lived, and what maybe can sustain you? And I came up with this, which I hope makes sense, which is there are good news for you and bad news for you. And the good news is that you're so desperately needed, right? Migraine needs you so bad, headache disease needs you so badly. But the bad news is that nobody thinks you're needed, nobody thinks you're necessary. And that's because nobody cares about migraine, right? And that's your job. Your job is to get people to care. And so you're going to hear a lot of people, you know, you're not going to be, nobody's going to think you're a hero, because your job is to convince people that migraine is important. And so the mission here is to reverse these two things. So Helen, can you move the slide forward? So the mission for advocates is to get to this, to render yourself irrelevant, right? To get to the point where it's lovely that you're helping us in advocacy, but you're not really needed, but everybody thinks you're absolutely necessary. And we've seen other disease groups get there, right? We've seen it happen for breast cancer. We've seen it happen for HIV, both of which are disease categories that get lots of resources, way more than their burden even. But which have been really stigmatized, right? So we can change this, but it's a heavy lift. I'm glad that you're here. I know that we can do it. And I know that, but you know that you're gonna have to sustain yourself despite the stigma, because it's the stigma itself that is the thing that you need to change. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. We're going to take questions. We're going to have a discussion at the end of the session. I'm going to welcome Dr. Young now, who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to certainly read his bio. He is a neurologist at the Jefferson Headache Center. He received his medical degree from Penn State College of Medicine and has been in practice for 30 years. The Jefferson Headache Center is one of the very few academic headache centers in the country. The center, founded in 1982, specializes in the treatment of patients with all types of headache pain. Dr. Young is the president of the past president of the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy. He is also the president of Miles for Migraine and also the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients. And you can read more about his research profile on our private website. You'll see that the link is there. And I'm going to turn the podium over to you, Dr. Young.
Okay. Shall I use my own slides from my screen?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay.
I think Helen has them up, but if you want to be in control, that's totally fine.
No, let's use Helen's. All right. So these are my disclosures, and there are many of them, and kind of normal for a physician and attending in my position. Next slide. So Dr. Kempner mentioned impact and how amazingly huge the impact of migraine and other headache diseases is. And one way to look at the impact is to look at disability, which is where migraine has its greatest effect, and total impact, which includes death and disability. And as you can see, migraine is number 2 for disability among all diseases in the world, and number 14 for impact. You know, a little bit behind, you know, say, you know, lung diseases or lung cancer or heart disease, but that's a very high position, and there are many diseases that are very important that you don't even see on that list. So to reiterate, next. Disability number 2, impact number 14. So for me, I was a young headache doctor, new in academics, and I was presenting a poster, and a very nice colleague from another field came up and looked at my poster and said nice things. And as she left, she says, "I'm glad you do headache. I don't like treating those patients." And it, it left me feeling something that I didn't like, and I didn't know why at the time. Next slide. So stigma is an established construct in the social sciences that describes an attitude, trait, or disorder that is deeply discrediting and may elicit some form of community sanction. So let me be plain about this. People are punished. Community sanction means they're punished for having migraine. Next slide. So, these are the three major types of stigma. Public stigma, which are those micro and macro aggressions, like the one I just showed you, that happen, day in and day out, that are so numerous that we often just don't even notice them. But over time, they just accumulate this burden on the soul and this profound effect on who and what we are. And then structural stigma, which are the rules and policies, and procedures that disadvantage people who have migraine disease. And then there's the self-stigma process, which, after a lifetime of getting these messages over and over again in every way that society can give you that message, inevitably almost develops self-stigma. And that is truly the most toxic of all the stigmas, the most harmful, when somebody actually believes this garbage. Next slide. So, I'm in this because I actually had an opportunity to study patients, my own patients, and the stigma that they experienced. And here's the raw data from my study, and this is in my office, and I looked at my episodic migraine patients and my chronic migraine patients, and we ran across the street and looked at the epilepsy patients. So epilepsy is considered a bad neurologic disease, and it's disabling, and it's and people have been working on the stigma of epilepsy. But as you can see, my chronic migraine patients had higher stigma scores, had a higher burden of stigma than the epilepsy patients and the episodic migraine patients. Next slide. And, I was able to look a little bit more. I showed you how chronic migraine has more stigma attached to it than episodic migraine or epilepsy, and episodic migraine and epilepsy are roughly the same. And I showed that the ability to work is what really correlated with the stigma. And that the reason that people with chronic migraine were more stigmatized than the epilepsy patient or the episodic migraine patients was that they had more trouble working because they had migraine every single day. That's where the stigma came from. It wasn't acceptable to have any disability from, such a disease as migraine. The physical component score, the ability to move and to do things also contributed to the stigma, because that, is unacceptable from, such a small disease as migraine. And we also found that the mental component score of our measure, depression, also heavily correlated with the stigma. But our construct is that the stigma is the driver of, the burden of mental distress. So when you do these things, can you go back a slide, please, Helen? We showed that chronic migraine and epilepsy, if you take away the disability, are about equally stigmatized. They're both, brain disorders that are show you've got a bad brain, and episodic migraine is a little bit less disabled, except for, less stigmatizing when you have zero disability. That's what we know about stigma from the point of view of the patient who's stigmatized. Dr. Shapiro studied the stigmatizers. He would interview, or he would study responses from people who may or may not have migraine about their attitudes towards people with migraine. Now, these are just generalizations, and there are plenty of women who stigmatize migraine more than men, but overall, men are meaner stigmatizers. Non-white people stigmatize migraine more. Younger people do more stigmatizing. People who don't have migraine do more stigmatizing than people who have migraine. People who fear pain a lot are stigmatizers. People who don't express empathy are stigmatizers. But people who don't understand and they don't fear the migraine are worse stigmatizers, and people with lower income are worse stigmatizers. So we have a little bit of data about what factors tend to make people stigmatize those with migraine more. Next slide. And as with the stigma experienced by the patients, the same thing was expressed by the non-patients. And so, if you ask the patient, if a person misses 10 days of work per year, they are much more stigmatized than if they miss 0 or 2 days of work a year. Next. And this is the feelings of the people without migraine are that, they're not showing up at work because they don't care. They don't try hard enough. You wouldn't want to, give them a job interview. You're worried they're malingering, and you don't trust them because of the disability attached to their migraine. Next slide. And in another study, the beliefs of people out there about persons with migraine is that a third of people believe that migraine is because of unhealthy behavior. 3 out of 10 think that people use migraine to gain attention or to get out of their commitments. And this is disturbing, as people who know many people who have migraine tend to hold more negative attitudes towards people with this disease, with migraine disease. And it may be selfish, in my opinion, and this is just speculation, that they're burdened and they don't like that they might have to make the bed or vacuum because somebody's got a migraine, or do more work. But I also think, in a perverse kind of way, it offers an opportunity, in that I suspect some of this is that people with migraine aren't doing the best job. We're not doing the best job about telling our story. And if we told our story better, we might be able to reverse this. And I think of that as an opportunity. Next slide. So I do want to touch on language. And I think that some of the stigma is embedded in the language that people use. And the patient community has come together and coalesced around this idea and made recommendations about how to speak about migraine and what language to use. And let me say that it is very hard to change. I found it very hard to change my own language. And it's a small process of me sort of kicking myself, day in and day out, as I choose the wrong word and I try to say it in my own mind better, and finally it starts to come out the way I want it to come out. But illness, disorder, and condition are downplaying migraine. Migraine is a disease usually, and sometimes we want to view it as a condition, not a disease, but usually as a disease. This to me is the easiest fix, and this gets, I read this so much, and everybody says this. Say migraine, don't say migraines. You say asthma, and you understand that it's a permanent condition that somebody has, and they get superimposed asthma attacks. So we have migraine, not migraines. Don't say migraine headache. Headache is just one of many symptoms of migraine. You're letting people believe this falsehood about migraine if you keep talking about your migraine headache, or worse, your migraine headaches. It's not something that we should be doing, is talking about schizophrenics or epileptics. That's considered, kind of, mean, and you're painting people with a disease as if their essence is that disease. Migraineur is the same thing. Maybe it sounds, all Frenchy and fluffy and maybe nicer, but no, it's really the same problem. It's a person with migraine or with migraine disease. As far as sufferer, I guess that's a little bit less specific for migraine because people suffer from, back pain and so forth. But the concept here is that it's really the choice of the person. I don't want to tell you you're suffering. I don't think that's right. It's my place to do that. You can say you're suffering, but I don't feel I should say that about you. And there's sort of a philosophical thing, and there's a little bit of choice involved in suffering. Pain may be inevitable, but a suffering maybe not so much. Certainly, as Joanna pointed out, this atrocious thing about the migraine personality and the migraine type person. You still hear that occasionally, though. Thank goodness, I think it's getting better. And then the word medication overuse headache, and we're trying to convince the International Headache Society that that is blaming the patient for their disease. Rebound headache is not that accurate, but it's neutral. Or medication adaptation is a description of the changes in the brain that are caused by medicine and that are worsening the migraine disease. So we're trying to get the official name changed, but I won't use it. I won't write medication overuse headache. I will say rebound headache on my charts because of that. Next slide. So stigma has consequences. And I pointed this out before. Next slide. And here's some examples. So this is structural stigma. So on the bottom, on the x-axis is disability. That's the official measure that the World Health Organization came out that countries are supposed to use to determine how much they allocate for a disease. So the importance of the disease is on the x-axis, and the NIH funding for research is on the y-axis. And this is much worse than it looks. You can see migraine and a box over there is doing terribly in getting funding compared to what it should be, but this is a log scale. And so, migraine patients are being screwed much more than this chart shows. Next slide. And next. So we're getting about 20 million. We should be getting about 200 million in NIH research dollars, perhaps 250. in terms of getting disability, migraine patients are getting screwed. As the burden of disease, the initial allowance rate for people applying for disability is about half that of the average of all claimants. As a percentage of the burden of disease, migraine patients are getting almost 1/20th of the disability payments that they should be getting. So, you know, the system that is supposed to, you know, be a right, something we earn for paying taxes, and that society, you know, is supporting us. If your disability is from migraine, you're about 1/20th as likely to get recognized by the government than the average disease. Next slide. And here are the allowance rates where migraine stands among all claimants and you know, where perhaps it should be. Next slide. So migraine stigma worsens pain. So a person with migraine gets symptoms. The symptoms cause disability. Because of that disability, society judges them and they get enacted stigma. And over time, they internalize that stigma and they get self-stigma, which leads to, you know, a whole host of consequences, but a poor quality of life, but also, you know, discrimination itself increases the magnitude of the pain. So the stigma itself and the discrimination that is embedded in that actually worsen pain. So it's like an extra tax. You got, you know, you owe $100 because you have migraine, and now you 130 because you have because 30 for the stigma, and the pain is now 130. It's bad for pain. Next slide. So, you know, as a community, we're thinking about what to do about the stigma. And a year and a half ago or so, we met in Washington and we had the Shut the Door on Migraine Stigma Symposium. And this is what I took from it. Number one thing that we can do about migraine stigma is disclosure. Other diseases have learned this. You know, if you think about the mental health community, if you think about, you know, Crohn's disease or other things, you know, they just put it out there and they disclose their disease, and they've learned that that's the most effective strategy. We need to do that as a community. And it's hard because it's stigmatized. So who wants to go out and expose themselves? But it's also the only way to change, in my opinion. Empathy must be nurtured. I think that we need to learn to tell our stories, and each person with migraine can, you know, always think to better tell their story, you know, and show the fight, the dignity, how the perseverance that it takes to manage a life with severe migraine. That disability is the key. That disability is the norm with migraine. And we're allowing this false tale to be told that, you know, it's not okay to be disabled by migraine. That's what migraine does. It's inherent. It's like almost definitional in migraine that it's disabling. Migraine is a brain disease, but we don't have to say that. You know, we can tell a different story. It's so many other things too. And you know, there is a stigma tax for saying that it's a brain disease. So don't say that to a neurologist, but, you know, to your mother-in-law, you know, say it's a, you know, it's a disease with nausea and light sensitivity and a lot of pain. leave out the brain. From other diseases, we've learned that if we, say the wrong thing, if we emphasize brain disease, for example, they did that for depression, it made things worse. So we really want to think about how we talk about migraine and the cause of migraine. Patients have to lead. There is no disease that has successfully fought stigma that was led by the doctors. It is the patients who have to fight the stigma. Doctors, let me take that back. Doctors can fight the stigma with other doctors. That's our job. We'll take on the ignorant doctors or help the patients with that. But overall, the movement has to come out of patients. And that it's like popping the balloon. It's not going to pop if we just try to do structural stigma, or if we do therapy to undo self-stigma, or if we only talk to our grandmother about her stigmatizing statements. We have to do it all. It has to be an all fronts attack. Next slide. So, there are many migraine heroes. This was, these are some of the migraine heroes. You see Dr. Kempner up there, Shirley Kessel, Katie McDonald, who are on this call. Wonderful people, who have done so much to destigmatize this disease. And I'd love to see all of you up there as migraine heroes who are fighting for justice for people with migraine and for a better life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young. And thank you, Dr. Kempner. So we're going to take a moment to take any questions you have. And while we're doing that, if you want to put them in the chat, or you can actually raise your hand. There's a lot of us on the call. And I'm also going to ask Helen if you could put up the discussion question on the slide. That we'll see. If you don't want to put it in the chat, just raise your hand. By doing that, you can go down to your bottom of your screen where it says reactions, and you can raise your hand and we'll try to call on you. So let me first, before we do that, the goal of this program is obviously for you to all learn, but then for all of you to act and to think and to demonstrate what you've learned. And the Act Now program, which stands for Advocacy Connection Team, is a team approach to having healthcare providers, most of you are fellows, to work with a group together as a team and to work with patients. And so we're going to ask each time for you to reflect and have a discussion around these two questions. So the first question for providers, and it really is for anybody here that's a healthcare provider or fellow, how has stigma affected your medical practice? And we're going to have a discussion around that. And then for all of you, but mostly for people with migraine and for caregivers, when did you first experience stigma? And did you realize you were being stigmatized? And I say, did you realize you were being stigmatized? Because the first time I ever experienced being stigmatized was when I was in my 20s and I had chronic migraine, and I was invited to a wedding of one of my friends, and it was an hour and a half drive away. And I woke up that morning and I was really having a very severe migraine attack. And I had to call her and tell her I couldn't come. This was before cell phones, so I'm kind of dating myself. And she couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe that I couldn't come to her wedding. And I tried to explain it to her, but she just didn't get it. And I felt so guilty. It was my being self-stigmatized really what was happening to me. And I didn't even realize it. I didn't realize that's what stigma was. I just thought to myself, wow, I just feel terrible. So I think that there may be times in your life where you maybe didn't realize that migraine is a stigmatizing disease, and maybe now you're more aware of it after tonight. So if you want to, either fellows or everybody else, if you want to spend, if you could probably limit your comments to about a minute, so that way we can get as many people as possible. We have about 15 more minutes left. So if anybody wants to raise your hand, and if you can't find the hand raising thing, just raise your hand physically and we'll try to find you. Here's a question. Dr. Young, how do we respond to a primary care doctor that does not get it with our chronic migraine? Before we ask Dr. Young that question, does anybody else want to answer that question? Don't all jump up on it once. And so, Dr. Young, you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew the answer, and being the kind of person I am, I think, we need to study this, because it's an incredibly important, but I think that, and this is really unfair to people with migraine, but, did they tell their story as well as possible? Sometimes I think that, you can tell the exact same story. You shouldn't have to, the doctors should figure it out themselves, but, and they'll come in with a biased view of whatever you say if they're, sort of in that camp. But you have a story, of, honorable fight against this disease, and that's what, tell that story as well as you can. Some people are jerks. Some people are jerks because, they were raised in that society, and, it takes time to undo that. It's a process, and sometimes you have to, find somebody who's more understanding, if you can.
Okay.
I don't know. Other providers, I wish I knew.
And I'll just,
I'm a physician, and I can just confront them and say, I don't have time for this. You're wrong, and that's, I know a patient can't.
well, I think Kathy commented in the chat, Kathy from Florida, said, with my visits to the EDs and having worked in an ED, I see stigma from nursing staff on the way to get help from providers. I would like to see more education of other healthcare providers in our system. So that's something that the community here, the migraine community, has talked about, getting education into the provider system. It's not as easy as it seems it would be, but it's something to possibly think about, as maybe this is your project for the end of the course. Maybe this is something you want to work on. So as I think, as we continue to have these discussions, you'll probably have self-realizations of possible ideas that will, stroke your passion and something that you might consider working on.
So I can take on Lisa's question. I think it's,
yeah, go ahead.
Because I think it's interesting and definitely not necessarily settled. Like, I know that Dr. Young and Champ have come up with this language guide, but language is ever evolving, and I think it's something that advocates can still continually talk about, and worth opening up. It's not worth opening up that black box. Like, why person first language? What are the pros and cons of person first language? migrainer was a word that I don't think came into fashion until Oliver Sacks wrote his book Migraine. I think he used it probably for its elegance and because he liked French, I'm not sure. But the reason I disliked it, I personally disliked it for a number of reasons. One is because adding ER to the word made it seem like you were actively producing your migraine, and it made it feel like, because the idea of personal responsibility seemed like a part of stigma, I thought it was good to get away from that word. So I had in my book advocated for person first language. Person first language, though, it generally, what it serves to do is to separate the identity of a person from the thing they have. This, though, can get very tricky with various kinds of disabilities. So you can think about people who are deaf versus the capital D deaf community. So there's a capital D deaf community that really genuinely builds its identity around the disability. These are people who use ASL and consider that a culture, and who may be very against people, parents getting cochlear implants for their children, and not teaching their children ASL, right? Because that's the death of a culture. So another example might be the movement towards neurodiversity, and thinking about things like autism and ADHD as not as pathologies, but as different ways of being, different ways of thinking, and thinking about neurodivergence as part of an identity that a person could embrace. So something that people with migraine could think about is like, is migraine part of your identity in a way that you want to embrace it? The answer for me is a resounding no. But I think that there are probably people with migraine who do, I think migraine is part of their identity and part of who they want to be. You know, I think there are other ways to build an identity in the disability community. I think people have built identities around being a spoonie. But that I think, Lisa, is the reason for why some people with disabilities really want to, who are against person first language, they really want to unify their identity with their disability. And that's maybe something that might become an issue within migraine advocacy.
Might I suggest that patients can call themselves, you know, what they feel comfortable with, but the doctor shouldn't, you know, or the medical journal shouldn't do that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you for that answer, Dr. Kempner. Anybody else want to verbally share anything? I see a lot of messaging in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read a couple of those. And if you want to unmute yourself and share anything that's not in here, then we can do that in just a minute. So Courtney White has written in here that she's had other doctors say to her that going into headache medicine is a disappointment or a disgrace, as if helping people managing their headache disorders is not worthy. The stigma from providers is strong, and it motivates me further to change that. Yes, and you should follow her on Twitter because she has a lot to say, and it's all very good information. Diane.
So by the way, that's called courtesy stigma. And so it's just so you know, and it's something that headache providers feel very strongly.
What, can you explain what courtesy stigma is?
Yeah, so courtesy stigma is when you are closely associated with somebody who has a stigma, and so the stigma rubs off on you. And providers have a stigma associated with the people who they treat. And so there have been studies that actually show the status, how specialties within medicine are fall within a status hierarchy, and how that correlates with a status hierarchy of diseases, and you know, that matches like stigmatized identities. Yeah, like fibromyalgia and migraine are like low on the disease status hierarchy. And of course, the doctors who specialize in the treatment of those diseases are also lower status. And I think that that's part of this courtesy stigma. Nobody wants to treat those patients. And it's funny because it really doesn't have to do with like anything economic either, although maybe Dr. Young would disagree with me, but I mean, there is a strong market for people who want to treat these patients. Maybe the reimbursement policies make it less profitable, but I don't want to get into that.
Okay, I see Adalia. I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, but you have your hand up. What would you like to say?
Hi, you said my name right. This is Adalia. No, I was just writing in the group chat that many times, during I was diagnosed with vestibular migraines and a vestibular disorder 2 years ago. And when I would tell people, I lost a substantial amount of weight because of this. Like I went like 40 pounds within 4 months. A lot of people would look at me and they would be like, why you look so ill? So every time I would say like either the word migraine, they would just look at me like, how can you be this sick for migraine? So I kind of got tired of just saying that word migraine, and I would just go, okay, I have a vestibular disorder, a vestibular migraine, because I felt like when they heard that, then they was like, oh, that's something so much more, because they didn't understand what, a person with migraine goes through.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've actually heard other people in our community not say the word migraine and say a serious neurologic condition or something to that effect because they don't want to share that it's actually migraine. So any comments from our speakers about having to duck and hide from what the true diagnosis is, about explaining to people? Is it an opportunity? Is it something that is needed to hide and not be upfront about?
People in other diseases, their number one advice to us is disclosure. Like, we have to get used to it and desensitize ourselves, from talking about this. And it's hard. In the mental health community, they actually, have it like almost like a coming out of the closet class, for people sometimes, and, to be supported and to learn how to do it and to discuss when you're going to talk about, your disease and to whom you're going to talk about it first. And we need that, and we need to learn and support ourselves across this community in doing that. But ultimately, we're not going to change anything until we start to, just talk about what the truth is, what the lives that that our community is living, and and make it plain and normal, and let them see your struggle.
This is Darlene from LA, and I agree with you, doctor. I just wanted to answer that question about the first time you had migraine, and I was like 12 years old, and the doctor said it was all in my head. The kind of interesting part about my situation is I have an identical twin sister with identical DNA, and she doesn't suffer from chronic migraines. So I didn't get diagnosed with migraines until 40 years later. So that's a good example. And I just fought through it as best as I could and thought it was sinus issues or all sorts of crazy things that I'm sure you guys all have heard. So I think the best way to get this answered is really to educate people.
If I could tell a little story, in the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients, CHAMP, they set up a stigma committee, in all the organizations, have a representative on it. And, the stigma, and I was in it as, I'm not a patient, but, as a stigma person for the stigma committee, and everybody said, what are we going to do first? And they all came up with kids. They're going to fight the stigma in kids. And I didn't get it for like a half an hour, but I now think that that's absolutely, the best place to start. If we fight it in the kids, we fight it in the teachers and the parents, and the kids' lives will be better forever if we can sort of normalize and be matter of fact and honest about this disease.
There's a lot of comments in the chat. Just gonna pull out, did anybody other hand raised? Yes, go ahead. Patty and then Francine. Patty, you're muted, so unmute yourself. Patty, say where you're from. Or you're still muted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Patty. I'm from, I'm in Philadelphia group, but I've recently moved to Baltimore. And I wanted to piggyback on what Dr. Young has just talked about, because I made a comment, but I realized in my fogginess, I made multiple typos, so nobody will be able to read it. I worked in a school, and I had a known migraine disease, and my daughter had chronic migraine, and the school nurse came to me and said, "Oh, your daughter needs to see a counselor because psychological help, because she doesn't like to be in class anymore." And so I began to think about, I've been talking when I was living in Delaware, talking with nurses, going to schools and visiting them and trying to give them some literature on pediatric migraine. But, there was really not, there wasn't that there was a resistance, but since they already knew it, they knew about the triggers, that they knew about the, that the child could control it. But I think another population are the parents. And I don't know how often we are pediatricians or pediatric neurologists are really educating the parents. I assume they're doing it better than when I was growing up, because my parents didn't believe it at all, that anything was wrong.
No, actually, I'm going to have to stop you there, but we're just about at time. And to answer your question, Dr. Young and I are both shaking our heads no, because they don't know. They don't have the education either. But I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear all of you speak. Next time you will be able to have the opportunity. I would suggest that you go into the Facebook closed group and you can continue the conversation there. We really want to encourage you to utilize the Facebook portal to talk with each other and get to know each other, especially your group members, so that when you do get to your final project at the end of the course, you will know each other better. And we really want all of you to meet each other in person one day, because so many of us spend time on social media talking with each other just virtually. But wouldn't it be great to have this actually happen in a live forum? So that's, once we get through COVID, that will happen. So you'll be getting an email from us with the resources that we put in the chat, and also two of the resources are on the Facebook closed group. And I want to bid you all good night, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Hi, Shirley. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Young. Thanks, Dr. Kempner.
Thank you. It was fabulous. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Great to see so many of you.